So we'll be looking at intimacy from a few different viewpoints. Some of them are trauma-informed, some of them are informed by tantric backgrounds and traditions. And it's all tied together by my experience within the realm of counseling and teaching. I've done over 35,000 client hours, one-on-one counseling client hours in my professional life. And for the last 18 years, I've been nonstop circling the globe, of course, thwarted by the pandemic, but before the pandemic, nonstop circling the globe, going from Australia and Asia to the UK and Europe to the US and Canada, teaching. So I've been very extensively teaching, and all of that forms the information that I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of, or dive you into different aspects. So when I'm talking about the embodied path to intimacy, what I'm really talking about is embodiment as a means of knowing oneself and then someone else. So there's many, many different ways to define embodiment, and the way I'm defining it in my work, and this is different in different contexts, is as being able to listen to the messages of the body. And when we look at listening to the messages of the body, what we're really looking at, and in the context of embodiment, is what in neuroscience is often described as interoceptive awareness. And so interoceptive awareness is our ability, which is native to us and also very, very important for our not only survival, but for thriving, is essentially our ability to feel our internal landscape. And our internal landscape is comprised of physical sensations, emotions, defined and undefined, the arisings of emotional material, and the accompanying thoughts. And that interoceptive awareness is the fundamental step, or the fundamental key to being able to relate not only to ourselves, but to others via our entire system. It's not useful in, let's say, intimacy, however we describe intimacy. Different people choose different styles of intimacy and relationship. And I'm not talking intimacy as in sex. I'm talking intimacy as in relationship, closeness, connectedness, which takes many different forms. So intimacy in that context, and embodied intimacy in that context, is being able to be intimate with ourselves as living, breathing humans with bodies and emotions and a mind, and then how through that embodied feeling, we also can feel another or others. Because when you can feel yourself, you're of course also able to feel someone else via your own body mind. That's not only mirror neurons, but of course empathy, distinctions around other people's behaviors, and also visuals, as well as intuitive feelings, and everything that comes with it comprises this. It's a kind of a conglomerate of information that allows us to relate to another body with our body. And of course, the more we can feel our own body, the more we're able to adequately and accurately feel somebody else's body, which isn't only important in intimacy, it's also important in realms like making proper decisions, setting proper boundaries, and social interaction, for instance. So when I talk about embodiment, I talk about being able to listen to the messages of the body. The body has an incredible tool set and genius that comes from essentially having always been the first line of defense when it comes to surviving and thriving. Long before we had brains that were as developed as they are now, our bodies already had the native intelligence to live and survive and thrive. And so very often when we look at how can we optimally bring the body to relationship, we have to also look at why aren't we always connected, and why aren't we always clued into the messages of the body? Why is embodiment nowadays, such an important buzzword? Is there so much talk about embodiment in the realm of therapy and also relational work and trauma therapy? And the reason for that, of course, is that it's the one aspect of our existence nowadays that is not as readily available as, for instance, our mind and the technology that comes connected with our mind. So with that said, and with having talked about embodiment, I want to spend a little bit of time looking at barriers to embodiment, because we can essentially say that embodiment and intimacy are the same thing. And of course, hence barriers to embodiment are also barriers to intimacy. Intimacy with ourselves, intimacy with a partner, intimacy with the world at large. So there's 3 common barriers to embodiment that I define in my work as a means of educating my students and also working with people who are actively engaged in that inquiry. I should say, because Jenny said that in the introduction, I developed a somatic release methodology called the nonlinear movement method. And as I began about 10 years ago to teach the nonlinear movement method as a modality for teachers, meaning we now train facilitators all over the world, I really drilled down on the barriers to embodiment as a means of explaining to people who were new to working with trauma and the body and somatics, how these things interact. So I've defined these 3 areas that are barriers to embodiment, and with that, barriers to intimacy. So the first one is stress and anxiety. And the second one being overwhelm and overload. And the third one being trauma. Those are the 3 that I define. Now, of course, they intersect, and these are arbitrary definitions to make sense of the material that I'm going to present to you, and as a means of understanding how and why certain tools work and why other tools don't work. So in defining these areas, we are essentially also defining the tools that help overcome those or break down those barriers to embodiment and barriers to intimacy. So stress and anxiety is one of these super, super important words and aspects that we all know about, but we're not always aware exactly how they influence our intimacy. So we can look at stress and anxiety from the lens of the nervous system. And when we look at it from the lens of the nervous system, we can essentially say that these are very simple terms so that they're easily to understand and that the tools are easily understand. So please give me license here. I'm not giving a neuroscience presentation at this moment. So when we look at the nervous system, we're looking at 2 key factors in how human beings live and survive and thrive, and that is parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. And most people know those systems as fight or flight and rest and digest, or sometimes rest and digest is also called feed and breed. And these 2 aspects of the system are working together, and in an ideal world, they kind of create the stance where they balance, and one goes up, the other one goes down, then it changes around again. And when that's done properly, and when the system functions properly, those 2 systems together form a homeostatic situation in the body and in the nervous system. So it's a really, really, really ancient and super elegant and very, very sophisticated system that allows each human to have optimal chance of survival and also optimal chance of thriving. And how they work together is quite simple. The easiest way to describe this is you have a moment of fight or flight. That moment of fight or flight is there to protect you and give you all the tools to survive. And then when that moment of fight or flight is done, rest and digest kicks in, you kind of de-escalate and then come to an equilibrium. Now, that's optimal situation, and that is not always how it goes. So when we look at stress and anxiety, we're looking at a function where essentially our system perceives danger. The important thing to understand, though, and this is no news to anyone, I'm just pointing it out for the sake of this situation, there's no real separation between a perceived threat and a real threat. And that's very, very important to understand. So our catastrophic thinking or our expressions of drama that are mental or verbal are equally perceived as a threat as the real thing. And that's important to understand because we somehow think that, a saber-toothed tiger showing up at my doorstep, if I'm in the ancient days of human development, is a real threat. And of course, me having catastrophic thoughts about having missed a deadline is not a real threat. But to my system, it is a real threat because the system doesn't know, is this actually going to kill me, or am I just behaving as if this is going to kill me? So because of that, we have constant stimuli of threat and danger all day. And I used to have a private practice in West Hollywood, California, which is an area where there's a lot of studios and next to the CBS lot. And so I had a lot of clients who, aside from having relational issues, also had high anxiety. So I developed this kind of model for my clients to understand how to work with stress and anxiety attacks. So I'm going to give you a short version of this. So imagine for a moment that you have a cup, and every human being has a cup, and each cup is differently shaped. Some are smaller, some are larger, based on physiology. But you have a cup, and in the morning, and this cup is the receptacle for all stress response or stress stimulus. And so in the morning, ideally, this cup is empty. That's already debatable, but let's just say the cup is empty. And then every stress stimulus is a drop in this cup. So you wake up, it's a loud alarm, drip. And then your first conscious thought is you're late, or you have a deadline, or something's wrong, drip, drip, drip. And so by the time breakfast rolls around, if you have children who are not getting ready, or you're late, or you're on public transportation on the way to work, you have negative thoughts, you're stressed. Maybe you get cut off in traffic and there's an actual threat to your body, drip, 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 drip. So these are all drops in the cup. Once you get to about 50% in your stress receptacle, you're going to have the first signs of fight or flight in the form of faster heartbeat, faster breathing, shallow, fast breathing. You might get a little bit of tunnel vision there. Your adrenaline starts pumping. You're getting tighter. You're clenching perhaps, and you're getting ready for that event where you will have to defend yourself or run as fast as you can. When you get over 75%, you are going to have a proper stress response. And of course, if the cup runneth over, so to speak, you'll have an anxiety attack. And an anxiety attack is essentially a fight or flight event. You'll have a full-blown, I need to get out of here, or I need to fight as hard as I can moment, as if the proverbial saber-toothed cat is at your doorstep. So what that means is that obviously, in order to not have that happen, you can employ a few strategies. But before I say that, I want to say that one of the fundamental issues with high stress and anxiety when it comes to relationship, and that's intimate relationship, all other relationship, and self, is that the fight and flight response by its very nature, cuts out your rational executive thinking function. That is on purpose, because when you're in an actual threat situation, you essentially have to override consideration and just go. So if there was an actual, I don't know, bear at my, I'm in a territory where there is bears or mountain lions, is at my doorstep, I can't go, should I call someone or hit that thing or run? I'm dead by then. So that cutting out of rational or reasonable thought is a fundamental aspect of surviving. It's not good for relationship or decision making when that happens in an actual, non-threat situation that feels like a threat. So with that said, how do we deal with a full cup? Well, there's 3 strategies. One is emptying the cup, and the emptying of the cup can be done acutely or preventatively. The second one is preventing drippage in the cup, so to speak. And the third one is creating larger capacity. So emptying the cup is everything you know about stress relief. So all the strategies for stress relief that are out there are cup emptiers. Meditation, mindfulness, going for a walk barefoot, hobbies, playing with the dogs, exercising, proper sleep, having a good meal, being with friends, physical contact, all the things that you know as being stress relievers are cup emptiers. So as I said, you can do them acutely. So meaning if you notice that you're above 50%, you could take a break, move your body, or go for a walk, or have a nap, or whatever else is one of your strategies, so that the cup gets emptied a bit. You can also do it preventatively, which a lot of people do these days, where you have a set of practices that allow you to preventatively empty the cup before it goes too full. One thing that I want to add here is that something that recently has gotten a lot of attention and press is proper sleep, because one of the things I said in the beginning is ideally that cup is empty in the morning, and that cup is only empty in the morning if you had proper sleep. If you're waking up and the cup isn't empty, you are already starting, with liquid in the cup, and you're going to get overwhelmed or stressed much faster. So proper sleep and also proper nutrition is a very important aspect here. A lot of anxiety comes from low blood sugar, and there's a whole research now on how do you maintain mental health and clarity via nutrition, and that's also something to be said here. So cup emptying is one strategy. Like I said, regular ongoing practice is preventatively, and then you have the acute situational attention towards emptying the cup. The next one being, of course, having less drops in the cup. And there's, of course, different strategies. There are things like having less catastrophic thoughts, less negative thinking, less busy mind. So internal strategies that can be achieved with the help of behavior modification, therapy, meditation, mindfulness, many other modalities that actually allow for a mental state that doesn't produce as much drippage, so to speak. And then externally, of course, there are many things one can do to reduce external stressors. And that typically is a bit more involved because it involves often other people and jobs and things of that nature. So the second barrier to embodiment, and with that barrier to intimacy, is overwhelm or overload. And the reason I am slicing that differently, even though the effects in the body are very similar, is that overwhelm and overload is something that we know. And we talked a little bit this morning in the women's panel about masculine versus feminine activity. And I was saying in the morning, I don't like to say masculine versus feminine because it creates a subtle right and wrong. So I often call it go and flow. So when we look at overload and overwhelm, what we're looking at is massive amounts of go, meaning we do things, activities that require a lot of thinking. So it's the overwhelm of the internal system producing a lot of thought, a lot of attention, a lot of focused forward motion activity. All the while, we typically do that by having a lot of external stimulus of lights. I have a ring light on right now. I'm looking at Zoom. There's a phone somewhere here. There's other lights in the room. So there's a lot of stimulus, external stimulus that's quite overloading on the system. All the while, I have internal stimulus of getting things done, being on task. When you do emails or, all of these things are very strong mental stimulation. That's not in itself a bad thing. However, everything we do a lot, right? Anything we repeat over and over creates habits. And the habit that is created by mental overstimulation is a very, very specific one. And that is bringing the energy up to the upper part of the body. Because the body is very intelligent, our system is very intelligent, and our system will pull energy from where it's not needed and allocate it to where it's needed. Because the human brain can only produce a certain amount of electrical energy per second. And what that means is we have to allocate energy where it's needed most. So when we sit in a chair, and we look at the computer and we're thinking and we're doing, and there's a lot of mental activity, the body pulls from where we're essentially parked, which is the lower body, so to speak. So what that means is we pull it up, we use it here as it's needed. If that happens a lot, that becomes a pattern. If this happens to the point where we have to actually effort to get all the energy there, then we have tension pattern, which very often manifests in neck, shoulder, TMJ, headache kind of symptoms, because it pools there and it no longer goes back down into the parts of the body. You've probably heard the term energy flows where attention goes, and that's what this is, overwhelm, overload. The attention goes up here, it goes towards doing, it goes towards getting things done, and then all the energy flows there. And then through repetition, that becomes a pattern, and now we have that kind of overwhelm, overstimulation aspect within our nervous system that doesn't allow us to de-escalate as readily. So what that often means physiologically is it has the same kind of feeling as fight or flight, meaning the blood pressure rises, the heart beats faster, the breathing gets shallow and faster, you get very focused, kind of tunnel visiony, you're very alert towards the one task. And at the same time, the lower body has way less energy. There isn't much felt. There's numbness, particularly in the genitals and abdominal area, because it's not really needed there while you're doing this. And the most important aspect of that is that when you do it a lot and when you pull the energy up a lot, you're actually creating tension in the pelvic floor. And that chronic tension in the pelvic floor in men and women alike creates kind of that tension pattern, and hold creates also physiological issues. And we see those very much in people who spend a lot of time in their head and on their devices. And so that subtle clench and pulling up then affects our both, let's say, developmental and also sexual, genital well-being, reproductive well-being, also our ability to tune in with our body, our intuition. There's, of course, that power center of, the hara, the dantian, that whole area around the solar plexus and belly, where a lot of power can be generated when that's online. So that said, right, when people talk about, oh, I'm so in my masculine, they're not actually in their masculine. They're just in their upper body as a habit. And so when we don't want to be in the upper body as a habit, the remedy, of course, we talked about the remedies with stress and anxiety. The remedy with overwhelm and overload is to bring the attention down. And because remember, energy flows where attention goes. So if all the attention is up, all the energy flows up. And if that happens a lot, you're like one of those bodybuilders that you see in the gym who only practice and develop the upper body, and then they have these tiny little spindly legs. And that is kind of our energetic body very often, where we just don't train our lower body as much as we train our upper body. So the remedy there, of course, is that the attention goes down, the energy goes down, and that gets practiced as well as a means of actually allowing for that to also be a habit, so that we can easily switch between go mode and what I call flow mode. Flow mode being all the things we just talked about: pleasure, intuition, power, enjoyment, being in the body, being in that kind of state of effortless enjoyment. And then go mode, getting shit done, essentially, in all different kinds of ways. So one isn't better than the other. Sometimes people get very into, I shouldn't be this and I should be that. It's exactly like it is in the nervous system. It takes both systems, and it takes both systems to really play with each other for the human being to be properly surviving and thriving. So practices and remedies for that overload, overstimulation, being in the head, are simple practices, but ongoing practices to bring the attention down. And those practices particularly are practices that are bringing attention to the lower body. So things like, I'm doing this as I'm standing, so it's easy for me to do, but you can do it seated, to kind of hip circles, wiggling your toes. I always have a ball, one of those prickly balls under my desk to run my feet over, squats, like squat-like situations, bouncing. I have all of these things, kind of in my back pocket, and I teach them as simple ways to get back. We'll do a little bit of that. So bouncing like this are all things that bring the attention down, bring the energy down. Now, once again, there is situational bringing the energy down, where you notice you're like this and you go for a walk, or you bounce, or you move your hips, or you do different practices. And then there is more preventative, ongoing practice where you train your body to have as much muscle in the flow department as you have muscle on the go department, so you don't turn into one of those bodybuilders with the spindly legs. So that would take repetition, and that would actually take practices. But they are very simple practices because the body is quite clued in and very, very intelligent when it comes to the balancing. So that's the second of the three barriers to intimacy and barriers to embodiment. Now, needless to say, everybody has experienced this at some point or another. When you are in your head and when you have this extreme mental overload, you're not very relational. It's kind of an interesting thing when you start getting into these head cycles of getting things done. There's a certain, I'm using addictive in a very loose way, meaning you want more of it. It kind of feels interesting. It becomes a game. The getting things done becomes more and more of a self-perpetuating situation. And very often when people are in that state, they don't actually want to feel their body because it's a distraction. Because, of course, when you haven't felt your body for a while and then you go back to feeling your body will feel achy or numb or, not so great. And people prefer not feeling that. So there isn't a great motion towards embodiment and intimacy when you are in one of those, total get shit done head trips. And very often we experience this, and I see this a lot, both in teaching and my private practice, where people essentially come home from a busy day at work, and now they want to have a more intimate and connected relationship, but nobody can be bothered because it's much easier to just sit on a couch and watch TV and not feel the body, or you can't even let it go, and nobody's home down there, so to speak. And that, of course, poses a problem, because when you're not connected with your body, you don't want to or can't muster that feeling for another body, and that wanting to connect and noticing the connection as strongly. So that overwhelm is a very big barrier to intimacy and embodiment. So the third of the three barriers to intimacy, and then I'll see if there are some questions or comments, is trauma. And of course, trauma is a very vast subject. I'm just giving you a kind of an overview so you can feel in your own body the different challenges as well as the different remedies. So I define trauma as an injury that necessitated a response. That's my personal definition for the sake of slicing this, meaning anything physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, societal, is that caused an injury that needed the body, the emotion, the mind to respond, to cope, to do something with it, has a very specific pattern it follows. And that trauma pattern is a pattern of survival, of course. And within survival, there's a few very key processes that are, once again, very elegant, but when not understood and when not dealt with, can cause quite a bit of issue. So like it was with anxiety and stress, when we look at trauma, we're looking at the body going, okay, we must survive. How do we survive? Well, as the trauma happens, the injury, the situation happens, the first thing that happens is, once again, the body starts going into fight or flight response. And with that, as I was saying earlier, there's a kind of dislocating or dissociating in order to survive. And that's really, really important to understand, because it's actually necessary for survival that we, at that particular moment, we don't feel our body so much. Let's just stick with a physical injury. If you're being chased by, a bear, and you have to hit that bear or a shark or whatever, you can't be worried about your knuckle. You can't feel much either. You need all the adrenaline, all the power. You need to breathe as fast as you can, hyperoxygenate the body. The heart needs to pump as fast as it can. The adrenals just pump everything out so you can either hit that thing as hard as you can or run as fast as you can. And as that happens, your executive thinking function goes, as well as you pull out as far away from the situation as you can, so you can still make somewhat of a decision, and also you don't have to feel everything that's happening. And that, of course, is necessary for survival. But when it's done technically, your system would de-escalate from that, so you can come down from that particular spike. Now, in trauma, that is not always possible. So when I was a kid, I used to endlessly watch those Richard Attenborough, Africa, kind of videos, animal videos. I'm a total animal nut, and I've always been. And there's always this classic scene that I'm sure you have seen in some way or other. And if you haven't, you should watch it, where, let's say, a lion chases a gazelle, and it's this full-on thing. The gazelle goes zigzag and runs, and the lion is behind it, and maybe the lion gets even a claw into the backside of the gazelle. And then if the gazelle is lucky, in some of those videos, the gazelle somehow escapes. And then you always see this long shot of the gazelle in the bushes, And in those old videos where they didn't do really fast cuts, they would just stay on the gazelle while the entire gazelle went like this and was shaking for however long it took. And then there would be like the last shake where the gazelle has like this elegant flick of the tail. And then gazelle walks away and starts eating. And that is the prime transition between fight or flight and rest and digest, or feed and breed. And humans have that too. We have the exact same mechanism where essentially at the end of a fight or flight moment, feed and breed, or rest and digest, takes over and gives the de-escalation. The adrenal system shakes itself, or the system shakes out the adrenaline, regulates the nervous system, and then there comes an end to that, and then we move on and munch on some grass, so to speak. But obviously that is not how it happens most of the time, because often traumatic situations are long-term, as in abuse or things like that, or they are such that you have to pull yourself together. Let's say a car accident. In, for instance, surgery, often that shaking is suppressed because, of course, nobody wants sutures to open or IVs being pulled out. But the body has that function. But when that function isn't able to engage, then that creates a kind of a remnant of a coping pattern that connects with, more emotional and also mental things. And then that causes a trauma pattern. And then you, of course, are familiar with triggers, meaning when something pops onto that trauma pattern that's very similar, doesn't have to be the same, but very similar, and runs that same pathway. And then you have the same reaction, even though it's no longer an actual, situation, but it's a trigger to an old situation, but the body reacts the same because, once again, body doesn't know the difference. It just needs to keep you safe. So with that said, trauma, of course, is one of the prime barriers to intimacy and to embodiment. And one of the things I realized, and which is why I developed nonlinear movement eventually, was that when I did couple sessions, very often I couldn't even actually address the things that were happening, that were actually happening, because one or both partners were in a trauma state, were triggered, or were in a chronic trauma state, and they were dislocated or dissociated, and they were not actually able to make proper connections or feel the other person. And so from that point, doing therapy is not only useless, it's actually, not a good thing to do, because you're actually adding to the traumatization by not addressing the fact that somebody is dislocated or dissociated or afraid or things of that nature. So with all of that said, when we look at trauma as a barrier to embodiment and trauma as a barrier to intimacy, we're looking at learning how to de-escalate from these trauma states and come back into that homeostatic state between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And that can be done in different ways, and there's different remedies to that, which I'll talk about in a second. But I want to just add that, of course, nowadays where, everything has to be bite-sized and kind of in Instagram format, they often in trauma talk about the 4 Fs, right? So that's fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And of course, in the olden days, when I went to university, I went to the University of Vienna, which, takes their trauma therapy quite seriously. And back then, it wasn't called fawn, it was called the Stockholm syndrome. Essentially, when you have to align with your aggressor for survival, right? So that's the 4th F. I'm not going to talk about that because that's a very complex and also obviously often a complex PTSD kind of situation that It's not for this talk, but I wanted to mention it because very often people know about the 4 Fs. What I do want to talk about is the 3rd F, which is freeze, because freeze is one of the really interesting states to understand when it comes to both feeling your body and how you function, but also how to be in relationship when you've had those moments. So freeze is one of those super elegant survival mechanisms, because in the early days of human development, right, there was fleeing, of course, there was fighting, but then there was another option that often had to be employed, and often by women and children and elders. And that is, you had to hunker down in the tall grass or hunker down at the back of a cave. And so if you for a moment allow yourself to feel what it would have to be like if you have to hide in the bushes because some, marauding, rival tribe comes by or something like that, or dangerous animals, then you understand what freeze is about. So first thing that happens in freeze, if you're sensitive, you can feel this, is your lower body gets demobilized. So when people get sensitive to their freeze response, they can notice that their legs get very heavy and very numb at times. And that, of course, it has to do with immobilizing yourself in, let's say, the tall grass. Next thing that happens is often described as flat affect. So you don't have a lot of movement in the face, and there's not a lot of blinking. Well, why? Well, you don't want to be seen in the bushes. Then there's a down regulation of the system. So it's the opposite of fight or flight, where the system mobilizes for optimal function. In freeze, the system actually powers down. Your metabolism goes down, your digestion goes down, your breathing goes down, your heart rate goes down. You get cooler so that you can maintain yourself motionless in that state without needing, extra energy or needing to do certain things. So there is a general feeling of immobilization and also an internal feeling of powering down, which is why often, in nowadays they educate people, but in emergency medicine, people would come into an emergency room and actually not display the kind of vitals you would expect from them in that, whatever accident situation. And that had to do with it being a freeze. And often these things weren't properly diagnosed. There used to be shock. People would go into shock. That has a lot, that has changed a lot. Now people are a lot more educated about that. So in freeze, everything powers down physiologically, motion-wise, phase-wise, which you can see in somebody who's in an acute freeze state. They stop blinking, their kind of gaze gets glassy and wide, which once again makes sense when you have to look out and see everything. They don't blink a lot because you want to kind of stay very vigilant. And then what happens with that psychologically, and that's important for when we talk about intimacy, what psychologically or emotionally happens is you feel totally zen. You feel super calm. And that super calm, of course, is so you don't have a freak out in the high grass. So very often people will say, oh, I think I'm handling this quite well. I feel totally calm. Maybe, but maybe you're frozen, right? And that's always the thing to look at. And that's why freeze is often hard to detect in ourselves and also hard to detect in a partner because it often presents as still and calm and zen. So freeze, of course, can be chronic or it can be acute. And depending when it's chronic, then somebody is, not very much able to connect. If it's acute, you'll be able to see it, but then it will pass. So when we talk about the remedies for freeze, we are talking about the movement of the parts that get frozen. So you've often hear this when people, do acute work. Wiggle your fingers, wiggle your toes, look down at your feet. Where are you? Blink. And then from there, what I call nonlinear or non-habitual movements, where you start moving your body in ways that unlock the freeze, and then people can feel again. So that's, of course, not always easy to do when you don't know that you're frozen, but once you get clued in that you're frozen, those are your remedies. And when you have a partner or a child who displays that, I did this with my dogs after the fire. I lost my house in the Thomas fire, and unfortunately lost many of my animals as well. And there were a few dogs who had gotten out of the burning house, and I wasn't there, so I couldn't, there was nothing I could do. I was in Amsterdam, but two of the dogs had gotten out, and they were so frozen that when you would pick them up, they'd be like this. And you could barely see a blinking. They barely ate. It was quite bad. And so I'd have my dogs on my chest, like they're back to my front, and I'd take their feet and I'd move my body in the nonlinear movement method. There's ways to do that. I just move my body with them and move their spine to unfreeze their system. And it took a few days to actually unfreeze their system because they were so frozen. You can do that with a partner, of course. You can move with them, you can hug them and move slightly. The movement is the key. It's not just physical contact, it's movement. And for yourself, it's movement that's not linear. That's very important. So that's stress and anxiety, overwhelm and overload, and various embodiment. And then, as I said, the remedies are multifold, and I can repeat them a bit later. But for right now, I wanted to see if you have any questions. And if you have questions, the best way to do that is twofold. You could write in the chat. Then I'll see them. Or if you feel particularly wild and dangerous, you could raise your hand and actually talk with me. One of those two options is good. And if you want to know how to raise your hand, down in the reactions button, there's a little reaction button. There is a hand raise bar on the bottom of that reaction button. If you press on that, you'll see it says hand raise. So that's an option. And you can also just type in the chat box. And I'll just wait here for a moment and see if anybody has a question. Summer, hello. Hi, you just have to unmute yourself.
Hello, hi there. Thank you for taking my question. I was late to this, but I heard a bunch of what you said, and I really appreciate it. And my question for you is, I'm recalling the first time I was very aware of a freeze, and it was I'm a queer person. I'm a they them female, and so I have a whole storyline of figuring myself out. But when I was 16 and got my first kiss from a boy, I went into freeze when it happened. And I walked back out to my car where my friends were, and I wasn't even sure if it had even happened. And I felt traumatized by it. And I've never really been able to reconcile what exactly happened, if it was connected to childhood trauma that brought that up, or so my question is, would you recommend any particular type of therapy or explorative work to kind of uncover where these sorts of triggers and things like that might have come from?
Well, let me ask you a few questions if you don't mind. Is that experience still affecting the way you are intimate with people, or the way you relate to yourself in your life or your intimacy?
Well, I think so. I have been single for about 5 years now. And previously, I turned 45 next week. So I had, and before that, it was just back-to-back, monogamous relationships, barely any time in between then. but what I'm almost 1 year sober as well. And what I've noticed is that most of my intimate experiences in my life, I had to be intoxicated or somehow like altered in my mind. And so I don't even know where I stand on what intimacy grounds, where I would be at this point. So I do think it definitely has impacted me, because right now I can't even imagine like going there, if that makes sense. Like in my current state of mind, it makes me almost feel frozen just to even think about it. Even I notice when I'm getting like flirted with online or something, sometimes I'm like,
yeah.
And then I just ghost. I just ghost the person.
Yeah.
So, well, I'm really sharing a lot of information right now, but I'd love some insight.
Yeah. Well, that I want to say to begin with, yes, that does sound like it would warrant some good exploration. And I'll give you some different ways that you could look into it. But I also just want to say that let me say it in two ways. Regardless of what happened before that moment of the kiss or what has happened after that kiss, of course, that's a pivotal moment for any human, right? But particularly when you're trying to find out who you are in the context of, being queer or feeling different than you think you should be feeling or things like that. It's a really heavy duty moment, because in that moment, you have to essentially face whatever it is that you're exploring. And that's true for every human, essentially, when they start intimacy, right? Meaning some kind of erotic connection. But it can be particularly tough and particularly challenging when you are not quite sure what's up and what's down, so to speak. And so in that moment, I've heard this many, many times, people will get really confronted with everything, and that can create very strong reactions. So that's, I would say, understandable and totally okay, and totally to be seen as the beginning of you becoming the human you are. And so that just as the perspective of, yes, that happened, and yes, that probably is something that can be unpacked. And so ways to unpack that are different. There's different ways to go. One is to get what I call a roadmap. And what I call a roadmap is to do some form of talk therapy or talk-related therapy. I like people who are therapists and also somatic experience practitioners, for instance, or things like that, where you actually get a bird's eye view of where you've come from and where you're going and what is the territory you're in. And that's useful, particularly in the context of sobriety, which, often when we have to numb, that's because our coping patterns are such that we can't really allow ourselves to feel certain things, or we've gotten into the habit of not feeling them because it's easier not to. So I think it would be good to find somebody who is maybe a somatic experiencing practitioner. And you can email me and I can give you a whole list of resources where, if you just put my name.com in, you'll get to my website, and there's a, contact thing, and I'll send you good practitioners. So that's one way, is to get a roadmap. The other one, though, is that regardless of what you remember or don't remember, you don't have to. You can move things out of your body because your body has native intelligence. And so somatic practice, actually getting it out of the body. And there's different ways to do that. Once again, I can give you resources, either by doing somatic release body work or by doing self-guided somatic release process. You can actually get your body to do the things your body knows how to do, which is break up, freeze, release old adrenal states, balance the nervous system, get into a homeostatic state within the nervous system. That you can do regardless if you know what happened or not. And I think a combo of those two is a good approach in general.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, I know we're out of time. So thank you.
What I was going to say. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Summer, for being willing to be open in this forum. I think that even though your exact issues may not be the exact ones for many of us, the methods that Michaela was talking about and that kind of trauma, that kind of wounding are pretty universal. And so what Michaela said, I think, can apply to all of us as we move forward in a greater quest for intimacy with ourselves and with our partners, and to realize our greatest fulfillment in life. So since we're at the end, Michaela, I want to thank you for all that you've shared with us today. It's really been a pleasure. And I'd like to just mention to everybody in the audience, we will be here tomorrow with other wonderful keynote speakers, panels, and experiential sessions like the ones that we've had today. The hours are the same. You can check the schedule back online, and we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you again, Michaela, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you everyone for joining. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Jenny, very much.